Welcome everyone to El Zman at Drisha. This is Mishnah in Depth, Bava Metzia, our first session with a new teacher for a new chunk. It's a new Masechet, Dr. Rachel Furst. The Mishnah in Depth project is a part of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. And people are welcome to join Dr. Furst every Sunday. And to this class is working with the most standard daily Mishnah study schedule, where we will be a group of learners where you will independently study 1 to 2 mishnayot per day on the Mishnah Yomit schedule, with this class meeting once a week, and over a course of weeks and months, we will complete tractates and even orders. And to anchor your learning individually, we have this class. And for those who have not had the pleasure of learning before with Dr. Furst, she is a scholar of Jewish law and Jewish history whose research and teaching focuses on Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, as well as women and gender. She holds degrees from Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Columbia University in the US, and she has held fellowships and taught widely in Israel, Europe, and the United States. This year, she will be teaching at Ben Gurion University and David Yellen's Teachers College in Israel, as well as at the Paideia Institute of Jewish Studies in Sweden. And she is coming to us live from Zichron Yaakov. Thank you, everyone. And there will be no source packet sent out. That's because the sources will be a PowerPoint shared on screen. And with that, I want to hand things over to Dr. Furst.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. It's really a treat to be with all of you for this round of learning Mishnah Bava Metzia together. As Kayla said, I am assuming that some of you at least are probably continuing students, so you've already participated in this Mishnah in Depth program for other earlier tractates. But for those who are new to the project, as was mentioned, the idea is that these classes on a weekly basis, and we're going to be meeting 8 times over the course of the next 8 weeks, that these classes are really, they accompany your daily study. So we encourage all of you to be doing that on a daily basis. And generally speaking, the classes that we'll meet on Sundays are going to be looking backwards and reviewing or providing some deeper insight into the mishnayot that you will have studied in the previous week. This week is a little bit of an exception. This past week, including today and tomorrow as well, if you are following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, you will have been finishing up Tractate Bava, which was the previous tractate studied in the Mishnah Yomit schedule and in this ongoing Mishnah project at Drisha. Again, it is possible that some of you participated in the course with Rabbi Alex Israel, which concluded last Sunday, which was really focusing on Bava Kama. And today, as I said, we're going to be starting to talk about Bava Metzia, although those who are following the Mishnah Yomit schedule will be learning their first Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia, tomorrow. So what I'd like to do today is provide primarily an introduction to the tractate with a bit of an eye backwards towards the end of Tractate Bava Kama. And in this particular case, as we will discuss at length today, the connection between the two tractates is such that it actually makes a lot of sense to review some of Bava Kama, or the end of Bava Kama in particular, by means of introducing the new tractate. Next week, next Sunday, we will look a bit, as I said, more in depth and provide a bit more kind of a overview and insights into the first chapter of Bava Metzia in particular. And then we'll be continuing again in accordance with the schedule each week, reviewing the mishnayot that you will have studied over the course of the previous week. I do want to mention, just as an aside, and I believe that those of you who signed up for this course may have already received this notice, one of the weeks of this 8-week cycle, and that is specifically October 27th. It's actually the Sunday that is right after the holiday of Sukkot or Simchat Torah. On that particular Sunday, apologies in advance. I won't be able to teach live, but there will be a pre-recorded session for everyone who is registered to keep on track. Okay. So with all of that, without further ado, I'd like to begin our discussion today by talking about an issue that some of you may be familiar with, and some of you may have heard in, again, the previous course on Bava Kama, which is the question really of the relationship between these three tractates, the three Bavot as they're called. Bava is an Aramaic word that means gate. So Bava Kama literally means the first gate. Bava Metzia, which we're going to be focusing on, means the middle gate. And Bava Batra, which is the Masechet, the tractate that comes afterwards, is the final or last gate. These three tractates, according to scholars, originally probably were part of one very large composite tractate called Nizikin. Nizikin means damages. And this, what was originally seemingly an enormous tractate of Mishnah, was the very first of the tractates in the order that is also called Nizikin. Bava Kama, which was, again, the previous tractate studied, was the first seder, or the first tractate, the first Masechet of Mishnayot in the fourth order of the 6 orders of the Mishnah, the order known as Nizikin. And I want to just, I'm going to use this opportunity to put up my PowerPoint to give you a chart that will provide a bit of an overview. Okay. So here's what I'm talking about. Again, we are at the beginning or towards the beginning of this, again, fourth order of the Mishnah known as Seder Nizikin. And you can see this is a chart that provides a listing of the tractates in Seder Nizikin. English name, Hebrew name, translation or definition of the name of the Masechet, and the number of chapters, and to be clear, it's the number of chapters of Mishnah in each one of these tractates, as well as the number of individual mishnayot. Now you can see that the first 3 tractates in Seder Nizikin are Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, as we just discussed. And then the tractate goes on to the Seder, the order of Mishnayot, goes on to Tractate Sanhedrin, Tractate Makot, Tractate Shvuot, etc., etc. Now, the general topic of this order of Mishnah is civil and also criminal law. And this is in contrast to, let's say, the order of Zeraim, which focuses on agricultural law, the order of Moed, which focuses on the laws, ritual laws pertaining to Shabbat and the holidays, the previous order of Nashim, which focused on issues pertaining to women, family, personal status, etc. This order, again, focuses on laws that relate in one way or another to civil and criminal legal system, as well as to the legal system as a whole, the Jewish legal system as a whole. And what I want to point out is that oftentimes the argument is that the organization, the ordering of the tractates within a particular seder of Mishnayot, usually, and you can see this if you glance at the number of chapters, the column that refers to the numbers of chapters of Mishnah in each one of these tractates, generally speaking, the longer, I should say, tractates are toward the beginning of the order, while the tractates that have fewer chapters, at least, of Mishnah were organized towards the end of the order. And again, I only provided for you an overview of this particular order of Seder Nizikin, but if we were to take a look at a more comprehensive chart that provided this information for all of the other Sidarim and Tractates, then you would see that that principle holds more or less true for all of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. But here, if you there's something that's a little bit awry, a little bit exceptional with regards to that theory, which is that the first 3 tractates, as you can see here clearly, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, each have 10 chapters of Mishnah, whereas the 4th tractate, Sanhedrin, has 11 chapters. The 5th tractate, Makot, in this list has only 3 chapters. And then again, we move into descending order with 8 chapters in Shvuot, 8 chapters in Eduyot, 5 chapters in Avodah Zarah, et cetera, et cetera. So we more or less hold to the order thereafter. This should sort of be a visual trigger for the question about the relationship of these 3 tractates right at the beginning of the order, which also have somewhat strange names. First gate, middle gate, last gate. And I say strange because if you look at all of the other tractates in this order, the names of the tractates refer in one way or another to at least one of the central themes or one of the organizing principles of the tractate, right? So Tractate Sanhedrin, for example, refers to the Sanhedrin or the High Court. It talks a lot about that. Actually, one focuses on what we might today call criminal law, but it focuses on the various ways in which the High Court operated. Tractate Makot, now here again, this seems a little bit exceptional, but the argument is that actually Tractate Makot is kind of an appendix to Tractate Sanhedrin because it focuses on one of the not capital, but one of the serious corporal punishments that was administered by the High Court, and that is makot or malkot or lashes. And so if you think of those 2 tractates as being really appendices or Tractate Makot as being an appendix of Tractate Sanhedrin, then you can see that that tractate originally might have had a larger number of chapters. But again, it raises this question. It should sort of flash warnings to us, or flash at least question marks, concerning the Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, which are also, as best I know, the only tractates in the 6 orders of Mishnah whose names are in fact Aramaic. Now, Sanhedrin itself, has come to be a Hebrew word, but that is not originally a Hebrew word. That's actually a Greek word or derives from the Greek. But Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, which are Aramaic names for these 3 tractates, were probably, as I said beforehand, not originally 3 distinct tractates called First Gate, Middle Gate, and Last Gate, but again, probably originally part of one longer and much more comprehensive tractate called Nizikin itself that would have had 30 chapters of Mishnah in it. At some point, it would seem, the rabbis decided that that very enormous tractate with 30 chapters of Mishnah became too unwieldy. And therefore, they decided to subdivide that long tractate Nizikin into these 3 separate sections, which came to be known as Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. And incidentally, we see there's already discussion in the Babylonian Talmud about using those names, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, about the different divisions. But one of the questions that I would like us to engage with now towards the beginning of the class is, what evidence do we have to support either of these theories? On the one hand, the argument that these tractates were originally part of one longer whole. And on the other hand, the argument that no, from a very early period, these tractates were conceived by the rabbis and organized by the rabbis as 3 distinct tractates. And there's evidence for both of these two arguments that I'd like to take a look at together, and I think it will also serve as a bit of an overview to some of the topics that were covered in your study of Bava Kama and that will be covered in our joint study of Bava Metzia over the next several weeks. Now, again, if we argue that Tractate Nizikin was this longer composite Tractate Nizikin was at a very early stage divided into 3 equal units. This is how it would have been divided. And again, it was divided fairly neatly into 3 tractates comprised of 10 chapters each. Now, that, by the way, in and of itself, the neat division into 10 chapters each is one of the reasons that some scholars consider the division to be a little bit artificial, right? It's very neat, but perhaps it was a sort of arbitrary or artificial division of, again, a tractate, a long tractate Nizikin that simply got a little bit too unwieldy. Another way that this very long original tractate Nizikin comprised of 30 chapters could be divided is into 6 equal units, as opposed to into the 3 equal units that we are familiar with as Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. It would also, argue some scholars, make a lot of sense to divide this long 30-chapter Tractate Nizikin into 6 units. I made a mistake I see here in the slide, and I'll correct that before I send it out to you. What I really mean is into 5 equal units of 6 chapters each, right? 30 divided by 5, so there would be 5 equal units of 6 chapters each. And the logic behind doing that is actually thematic, right? So for example, if we were to divide all 3 of these tractates, if we were to look at them as one long tractate, Nizikin, and start to subdivide them, we would see that Bava Kama chapters 1 through 6 all in a way deal with questions of damages to property, right? You may recall that Tractate Bava Kama, for those who have been learning, started out with a discussion of the 4 avot nizikin, the 4 primary categories of damage, right? And then began to delve into them in more depth. And that's really chapters 1 through 6, all deal with damages to property. Moving along, Bava Kama chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, along with Bava Metzia chapters 1 and 2, so again, another unit of 6 prakim, 6 chapters. Those 6 chapters, despite the fact that that unit would span what we today think of as 2 separate tractates, 2 separate mesechtot, that unit would thematically hold together insofar as all of those chapters relate in one way or another to questions of theft and lost property. Similarly, the next unit of 6 chapters, Bava Metzia, spanning Bava Metzia chapters 3 through 8, all of those chapters deal with issues, and we're going to see these together in the coming weeks, issues dealing with guardians, shomrim in Hebrew, and workers. Bava Metzia chapters 9 and 10, as well as Bava Batra chapters 1 through 4, so that's the next unit of 6, deals all with land and buildings, again, despite the fact that it spans what we think of as 2 separate tractates. And finally, the last 6 chapters of Bava Batra, chapters 5 through 10 of Bava Batra, it's hard to claim that there's one exact theme that holds them together, but it deals with assorted topics, as I wrote here, including sales, inheritance, and legal documents. So again, the reason that what I'm trying to point out here is that this series of 30 chapters, all of which deal with, very mundane halachot, very mundane laws pertaining to everyday occurrences that people deal with, civil law in its breadth, can be very neatly divided thematically in a way that transcends the, again, possibly arbitrary division of the 30 chapters into these 3 equal neat units that comprise Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra. And all of this would argue again in favor of studying these tractates together as really a continuation one of the other. But there are in fact other ways of supporting both of these 2 perspectives, both of these 2 ways of looking at this long series of mishnayot and subsequently Talmudic commentary. One argument in favor, or one literary support for the theory of thinking about these 30 chapters as one composite tractate, one long tractate Nizikin, is in fact the very last Mishnah of Bava Batra. Now, again, I want to point out to you, right? Bava Batra is the final gate, right? It's the last of these 3 tractates that we have today. And the very last Mishnah of this very last tractate, we're not going to read the whole Mishnah in depth. Hopefully, some of you will continue on to study Bava Batra and you'll get to it in a couple months' time. But what I want to point out is that the very end of this very last Mishnah makes a kind of sweeping thematic statement that seems to argue, or seems to suggest, that this Mishnah could certainly be read and understood as the conclusion, not only to, again, what we think of as Tractate Bava Batra, but rather to this entire series of laws, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, that pertain to civil law, monetary law, etc. And again, those of you who are interested can take a look at this a little bit more closely afterwards. But I want to direct your attention now just to these, the words that appear here in color, the highlighted words, where Amar Rabbi Yishmael, and again, it comes in the midst of a more specific dispute between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. But Rabbi Yishmael says, "Harotze sheyachkim ya'asok b'dinei mamonot, she'en lecha miktsua b'Torah gadol mehen." Right? One who wants to become wise should engage in the study of monetary law, as there is no greater discipline in the Torah, and it is like a flowing stream. I'm sorry, I should have continued reading in the Hebrew. Shehen kim'ayan hanovea. Right? So this is the kind of, sort of broad, sweeping statement that one would expect to kind of to sum up a tractate, the topic of a tractate. But the topic that's being referred to here, monetary law, certainly does not pertain only to Tractate Bava Batra as we have it today. It really seems to refer backwards to all 3 of these tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. And again, this is therefore a literary support for viewing these 3 tractates as one composite Masechet, one composite tractate. By the way, I just want to mention in parentheses, although some of you are probably familiar with this, that the word Masechet in Hebrew, we translate it in English to tractate, but Masechet literally means a weave. These are tractates or Masechtot that were woven together of all different kinds of laws and traditions that were probably circulating among the rabbis for many centuries before they were actually officialized and kind of consolidated into the form of Mishnah that we know today, the form of Mishnah that became canonized sometime towards the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era. And again, the attribution is usually to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and his disciples. But the traditions, again, it was a weaving together of traditions that were certainly extant even earlier than that. On the other hand, I also want to point to a literary support for the idea that Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, these 3 tractates as we know them today, were in fact a very early very early rendition of the Mishnah, that there was not some kind of arbitrary later divvying up of a tractate that had become too long and unwieldy. And that is the fact that if we look at the opening mishnayot of each one of these three tractates, and I organized them here into three columns. I apologize that I did not provide the English here. I wanted you to see the Hebrew because the literary commonality jumps out in the Hebrew. You can see that the opening mishnayot of each of these three tractates is not coincidental, was not coincidentally rendered as the opening Mishnah. It is very striking that the opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Kama begins Arba'a Avot Nizikin. There are four main categories of damages, Hashor, Habor, Hamavira, Haver, and we're not going to go through that whole Mishnah, but it begins sort of by using this numerical hook to begin talking about different categories of damage. And similarly, the opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia begins, Shnaim ochazin batalit, two people were holding onto or grabbing onto the same talit, the same piece of cloth. Ze omer ani metzatia, ze omer ani metzatia. Each one of them was claiming that he had or she had found this cloth first, this object first, right? Again, using that number as a kind of literary hook to move into one of the opening subjects of this tractate. Now, we're going to talk in just a moment about how really this opening Mishnah, this opening chapter of Mishnayot in Bava Metzia is a direct continuation of the last chapter of Bava Kama, but nonetheless, the argument is it's not coincidental that the tractate begins in a way that is at least in a literary sense, parallel to the opening of Bava Kama, that demonstrates or indicates that there was literary foresight, literary forethought here, and that in fact, it was an early editor of the Mishnah who decided to divide up this tractate, not in an arbitrary way, but in a conscious way. Similarly, whereas Tractate Bava Batra, the last of the three, does not open with a Mishnah that uses this kind of numerical hook, there is a very clear parallel in language between the opening Mishnah of Bava Metzia, which is this middle column, and the opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Batra. And you can see by my underlines here that there is very parallel language that's used in these two Mishnayot. If in the opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia, here in this middle column, we have Ze omer ani metzatia v'ze omer ani metzatia. Ze omer kula shali v'ze omer kula shali. Ze yishava she'en lo ba pachot michatia v'ze yishava she'en lo ba pachot michatia. And we're going to talk in more depth about precisely what the arguments are. But just listening to that language, you will surely hear a sort of resonance or an echoing of that language when you turn to the first Mishnah of Tractate Bava Batra in the third column here, where again, the topic is a different one. It's talking about shutafin sheratzu la'asot mechitza b'chatzer, two partners who shared a courtyard in between their houses or buildings, and they wanted to make a division between the two of them within this courtyard, right? And it talks about the different ways in which they might build that dividing wall. But again, listen to the sound of the language that the Mishnah uses here to describe the different rules that are to be applied. Zenoten shloshat tfachim v'zenoten shloshat tfachim. Bagazit, that's a different kind of building material. Zenoten tfachim v'mechza v'zenoten tfachim v'mechza. Bikfisin, which are small bricks. Zenoten tfachim v'zenoten tfachim. Bilevenim, larger bricks. Zenoten tefach v'mechza. Again, without even getting into the particulars of this law, you can hear that the language is very similar to the language used in the opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia, which again, literary scholars will argue demonstrates or certainly supports the idea that the division of these three tractates was not at all arbitrary, but was very consciously done by an early editor of the Mishnah. This argument, the argument that in fact the division into the three bavot, the division of civil law into these three distinct mesechtot, was a very early and original editorial choice, is the position that is famously adopted by Maimonides, by the Rambam, in his commentary on the Mishnah. His commentary on the Mishnah covers a whole wide array of different topics pertaining to the Mishnah as a whole, as well as the individual tractates. It was actually written in Judeo-Arabic, not in Hebrew. The Hebrew that we standardly use today was an early translation of his original composition. So I'm just going to read it quickly in the English translation. Following Seder Nashim, and this is the part of the introduction where Maimonides goes through and describes each of the 6 orders of Mishnah and their subject matter and the way that they were organized. Maimonides argues that following Seder Nashim, he, meaning Rabbi Judah the Prince, the editor of the Mishnah, subdivided the subject matter in Seder Nizikin, that's again our order of damages, and separated the first tractate thereof into 3 parts, right? So Maimonides here is arguing that this division into the 3 gates, the 3 bavot that we have today, was already done at the very early stage of editing that is attributed to Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He began with Bava Kama, the first gate, which deals with various agents of injury and how to avoid them, such as an ox, a ditch, consumption, the laws of assault, and their like. A judge is obligated to first litigate the removal of sources of injury from among the people, right? So Maimonides here is making an argument as to why Bava Kama, with its particular series of mishnayot that deal with these topics that he just listed, why that very specifically came first in the organization of Seder Nizikin. Next, he says, follows Bava Metzia, the middle gate, which, and this is a good overview of our upcoming tractate, deals with claims, deposits, hirings, that is hirings of workers, the laws of borrowers and hired laborers, and everything else that is appropriately connected with this topic. This is similar to the sequence in scripture. Namely, after the laws of ox, ditch, consumption, and if men fight together, the Torah speaks about the 4 types of watchmen, right? So Maimonides is making an argument here that the organization of the tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, is not at all arbitrary, but in fact follows the order of the sources of these laws in the Bible itself. And in just a moment, we're going to take a look briefly at some of these verses in the Torah in order to demonstrate what Maimonides is arguing here. But I want to continue here and read the 3rd paragraph, where Maimonides goes on to say, then comes Tractate Bava Batra, the last gate, and its subject matter deals with laws about division of property, laws pertaining to dwellings held in partnership, laws concerning neighbors, the annulment of a sale or transaction due to discovery of a physical defect therein. It further speaks of the sale and acquisition of property, how to adjudicate these cases, and the laws of bonds and inheritance. This section is described last, meaning Bava Batra and its subject matter comes last in the order, because it consists entirely of tradition and legal arguments, none of it being explicit in the Torah. So again, Maimonides is arguing that it is no coincidence that the mishnayot of Bava Batra were organized last in this series, because they, he says, are the ones, these are the laws of damages or the laws of sort of civil laws that have the least scriptural basis, or in some cases, none at all. Now, Maimonides goes on, and we're not going to read this in depth, he goes on and on. I just brought you the first paragraph of his, where he continues to explain why, in his opinion, the remainder of the tractates of Seder Nezikin were organized in the order, appear in the order that they do. And again, his argument is not based on the number of chapters of Mishnah, any kind of descending order or anything like that, which other scholars have taken note of. He argues that it's really all thematically organized. And again, just to provide a little bit of a textual sense of what Maimonides was arguing, I want to just briefly, we're not going to have a chance today together to read through all of these verses, but I invite you to do so on your own. In fact, I would really encourage everyone sometime in this coming week, as you move into Tractate Bava Metzia, to take a few moments to read through the main biblical sources of these mishnayot, of the laws, I should say, that appear in these mishnayot. And again, I want to point out that in contrast to some other laws, let's say, for example, the laws of Shabbat, which the rabbis Chazal themselves describe as mountains suspended on a thread, because the laws of Shabbat, as we know them from the Mishnah, have such minimal scriptural basis, or as compared to other laws that the rabbis described as really floating in the air because they have no scriptural basis at all. In fact, the laws that appear in Bava Kama and Bava Metzia are laws that the rabbis bring as an example of rabbinic iterations or rabbinic sort of castings of laws that have a very significant amount of scriptural basis. And the main source, the first source of these laws is, as you can see here, Shmot Perek Kaf Aleph, Exodus chapter 21, and subsequently Exodus chapter 22, and Exodus chapter 23 as well, which we're going to see a bit later in our discussion. And again, by just taking a very quick glance, and I invite you to come back afterwards, you can see that many of the topics that were covered in Bava Kama, so that is first damages between people, damages caused to human beings by other human beings, such as when two or more parties fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, or when a slave owning party strikes the eye of a slave, I'm now in verse number 26, male or female, and destroys it. So again, we're talking here about injury that is caused by a human being. That's one of the subjects of Tractate Bava Kama. The more famous, perhaps, and opening subject of Tractate Bava Kama is what begins here in verse 28. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten. And again, here, this is where the Torah goes on to talk about all of the damages that might be caused by animals. And this is continued here in the verses that you see on this second slide. When a party opens a pit or any party digs a pit, this is again another one of the famous of the four avot nizikin. One of the four major categories of nizikin is the bore, the pit that might cause damage. Again, in verse number 35, you can see more discussion about the ox. And then starting in verse number 37, when any party steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the Torah launches into a whole long discussion about thievery. And this is the major topic of the end of Tractate Bava Kama, the last chapters that, again, those of you who are studying either on your own or with Rabbi Israel, discussed the last more or less 4 chapters of Tractate Bava Kama deal with the differences between Gneva and Gezela, 2 different categories of stealing. And again, the source for all of that Mishnaic law is really these verses here in Exodus, in Shmot 21 and 22. And so that's what the Rambam was pointing out. That's what Maimonides was pointing out when he said that these the halachot that appear at the beginning primarily in Tractate Bava Kama and then in Tractate Bava Metzia as well, have a strong scriptural basis. This is precisely what he meant. and again, this is just the continuation of Exodus 22. I'll be sending out, as I mentioned before, these slides after the class, and you're welcome to take a look at these sources, at these verses in greater depth. I want to take a look at one, though, sort of final support for the suggestion that Tractates Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra were in fact originally organized as one long Masechet that was at some point or another more or less arbitrarily divided into three, and that is the manuscript support that is provided here in front of you from the very famous Kaufman Mishnah manuscript, but that is supported by other early Mishnah manuscripts we have as well. The Kaufman Mishnah manuscript, which is the earliest complete manuscript of the Mishnah that exists today, or that we are aware of today. It was written in the 10th or possibly the 11th century, either in Italy or the lands of Israel. There's a lot of question marks here that are the sources of ongoing debate between scholars. But in any case, what you can see here before you, it's a very beautiful manuscript, a very clear, clearly written manuscript. And what you can see here in the very far right-hand column of your screen, right there in the middle, where there's a little sort of looks like a heading, you can see that it begins Shnayim ochazim betalit, ze omer ani metzatia, v'ze omer ani metzatia. Right? I hope everyone can see that there on the right-hand column. That's the beginning of what we know today as Tractate Bava Metzia, the tractate that we're going to be studying together. And what you can see that, again, I called it a little heading, but in truth, it's not really a heading for what comes, for what begins Shnayim Ochazim, so much as it is a conclusion, post-heading, I guess you might call it, to the section that came immediately before it. You can see that it says there, Perek Yud, Halacha, or Halachot Yud Bet. And what that is sort of summarizing is that the previous chapter that was just concluded in its writing is the 10th chapter of the tractate and includes 12 halachot, right? And that's a reference to what today we refer to as the last or the 10th chapter of Tractate Bava Kama. Now, if you take a look at the third column here, you can see about a third way down of the page, another little heading that says, Perek Yud Aleph, Halachot Chet, which means this little section that begins with Shnayim Ochazim in the first column and concludes after the first third of the third column here, that section comprises chapter 11 and contains 8 chet halachot. Now, chapter 11 of what? Right? We said Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra each have 10 chapters of Mishnah. What this demonstrates is that the scribe of this Kaufman manuscript in the 10th or 11th century was counting what we think of today as the first tractate of Bava Metzia, the tractate we're going to be studying next week, as in fact not the first chapter, of Bava Metzia, but rather the 11th chapter of something else. What's that something else? Well, obviously this longer, much more composite tractate known as Tractate Nizikin. Now, you might be wondering, I mentioned in passing that the Babylonian Talmud itself refers to the Bavot, this division of 3 that we have today. Now, there's some dispute as to when exactly the Babylonian Talmud was redacted or concluded, but it was certainly before the 10th or the 11th century. So what does it mean that in the 10th or 11th century, the scribe of this, again, what is considered to be one of the most reliable manuscripts of Mishnah, is still referring to an 11th chapter of Tractate Nizikin. When then could this division have happened? And the general consensus, and with this I'm going to conclude that particular discussion, the general consensus among scholars is that there were probably two different traditions of Mishnah, one that was dominant in the land of Israel, which is where the Mishnah itself was originally composed, and one that was dominant in Babylonia, which is where the Babylonian Talmud, which came to be the Talmud, the most accepted and widely used Talmud, was composed. That is to say, the rabbis who composed the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbis in Babylonia, they already, several centuries before the Kaufman manuscript was, several, if not more, centuries before the Kaufman Mishnah manuscript was transcribed, they already had a tradition that referred to this enormous tractate as three distinct ones. And they might have had the tradition that really saw it almost as an original rendering of that long subject matter into three distinct sections. Whereas in the land of Israel, and this is supported, by the way, by manuscripts of the Jerusalem, Israel-based Talmud, in Israel, the tradition was that in fact, the Mishnah was originally one long Seder Nezikin. They continued to refer to one long Seder Nezikin much, much longer. And again, this has implications for the way that we think about the relationship between these tractates, and we'll continue to talk about that in coming weeks. But with the time that we have remaining today, what I would like to do with the last bit of time that we have together today is to begin to delve into the opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia as a way of also looking, as I said, sort of looking backwards towards Bava Kama and demonstrating, again, regardless of how we think about the division, demonstrating the connection between these two Masechtot. And also as a way of sort of concluding Tractate Bava Kama and looking forward towards Tractate Bava Metzia. So this opening Mishnah, which again, those of you who are following the Mishnah calendar, the Mishnah Yomit calendar, will be studying tomorrow. This very famous opening Mishnah reads, Shnayim ochazin betalit. Two people come to court holding a garment. Ze omer ani mitzatiha, v'ze omer ani mitzatiha. And by the way, I'll just mention that generally speaking, the English translation that I will be using here in class is that which appears in Svaria. It's the Steinsaltz Neue edition, Koren Neue edition translation of the Mishnah. It's available to all of you very easily online in Svaria and elsewhere. But of course, you should feel free to study the Mishnah in the original or with any translation that you choose. So in any event, two people come to court holding the garment. This one, the first litigant says, I found it. That one, the second litigant says, I found it. Ze omer, kula shali, v'ze omer, kula shali. This one says, all of it's mine, and that one says, all of it's mine. How does the court adjudicate this case? And the Mishnah very famously says, each one of them takes an oath that they do not have ownership of less than half of the garment, and then they divide the garment. We're not going to focus on the next scenario in the Mishnah, but the next scenario in the Mishnah refers to people who are arguing about a different division of this garment that they both grabbed onto. Now, we said these mishnayot in Bava Metzia, as well as those in Bava Kama, have a scriptural basis. What is the scriptural basis? What is the biblical source for this dispute between these two litigants who are fighting over a piece of cloth, or really we could imagine it as any object that they found together? What is this basis in the Torah for any of this? And the answer briefly is, although we're going to see that there's a very pointed distinction between the way the Torah presents this subject and the way the Mishnah does, the basis for this ruling in the Mishnah is in fact the laws of avedot, the laws of lost objects that, as we mentioned earlier, appear, it's mentioned briefly in Sefer Vayikra, but appears primarily in two sources in the Torah. First in Sefer Shmot, in chapter 23 of Exodus, the continuation of those verses we took a brief look at. And then as well in actually this past week's Parashat Shavua, in Parashat Kitetse in the book of Deuteronomy. And I want to take a brief look at those two Torah sources. I'm skipping forward a few slides here, excuse me. So the first Torah source for this law, as I said, is Shmot Kaf Gimel, where the Torah says, when you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless help to raise it. Right, so this is the first source for what we might call Hashavat Aveda, the obligation, Torah-based obligation to return lost objects that you stumble upon or find. And the Torah phrases it here with a particular focus on the enemy's object or item, right? Specifically, when you find an item that belongs to somebody with whom you do not have a good relationship, someone to whom you are not so positively inclined, the Torah in Sefer Shmot nonetheless very pointedly obligates you to attempt to return that item or that animal in this case to its rightful owner. Now, in Sefer Devarim, the Torah presents this rule in a slightly different fashion. And let's take a look at those verses. If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your peer. If your fellow Israelite does not live near you, or you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it home and it shall remain with you until your peer claims it, and then you shall give it back. You shall do the same with that person's ass. You shall do that same with that person's garment. And so too shall you do anything with anything that your fellow Israelite loses and that you find. You must not remain indifferent. Now, just briefly, and I hope that in future weeks, by the way, we're going to have a lot more opportunity for interaction and participation. I apologize that today was a little bit more of a lecture with me talking, but I do want to ask you now to think for a moment, and if anybody has a suggestion as to what is the difference between the Torah's presentation of this law in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. If anybody has a suggestion, they're welcome to just unmute themselves. I'm sorry that I can't see hands raised so well.
It's just interesting in Deuteronomy how it expands from just like, lost livestock to other lost objects. And I might not assume that like I have to treat lost objects in the same way that I have to treat lost animals.
Okay, and certainly the Mishnah talks in great depth in Bava and elsewhere about different kinds of objects or animals and what we might assume about them. So you're right to point out that Deuteronomy seems to be making clear that this ruling is not particular or not exclusive to animals. So that's one difference between the two of them. Anything else that you notice about the difference between Exodus's phrasing of this halakha, this law, this commandment to return lost items, and Deuteronomy's presentation?
Yes, we're dealing with enemy in the first, and we're dealing with fellow Israelite who could conceivably be an enemy, but it's not stated that way.
Yeah, so exactly. Thank you for pointing that out. So you're right that the enemy of Exodus, it's not specified whether that person is Israelite or other. And certainly there could be overlap between these two categories. But nonetheless, it is striking that in Sefer Shmot, this is a sort of universal requirement. Regardless of who the owner is, you are obligated to return the item. Whereas in Deuteronomy, it's a much more particular commandment. Your fellow, the other Israelite, right? Somebody who you have a connection, an inherent connection to, that's the person to whom you are obligated to return the item. in any event, and then we could say a lot more about that distinction, and we don't have time to go into that right now. But what I do want to underscore is that regardless, it is very clear that the Torah here is making a strong value statement. Right? The Torah is trying to teach us a moral principle, a value that one is obligated to return lost items. And again, the language that the Torah uses are things that are, right, things that the Torah is talking about in Avedah, things that are lost. Now let's move back for just a moment to the Mishnah that we saw, this opening Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia, where here the Mishnah, again, you might be thinking to yourself, this is not even, what is she talking about? What is the connection between those Torah verses and this Mishnah, Shnayim Ochazin B'Talit? Why would we even say that that's the biblical source for this? Well, I want to point out that, as I said before, Tractate Bava Kama, in the very last chapter 10, which some of you may have studied this past week, already begins to move towards this discussion of ownerless objects, or objects that are found and it's unclear who the owner is, or that two people who were clearly not the original owners claim. The Mishnah, already the second Mishnah of chapter 10, which is talking about customs collectors and is, sort of coming off of another discussion in the Mishnah, begin to talk about ownerless items. And why are these items ownerless, and who can then make a claim on them? They're ownerless because the original owners, as I underscored here, despaired of retrieving the items. It brings up this very sort of classic construct, this classic concept of yeush, of an owner despairing of the item that has been lost and thereby rendering it hefker, or ownerless, opening the door for two people, like in our Mishnah, to come along and claim ownership over the new ownership over this now newly ownerless object, right? So the Shnayim Ochazim B'Talit, these two people are claiming ownership over an object that was not originally the property of either one of them, right? Two people, this is the way that we have to envision this Mishnah, chanced upon an ownerless object at the same time, and both grabbed onto it. Each one of them claims, I found it first. And each one of them claims, I found it first, and therefore the whole thing belongs to me. And because neither one of them is conceding any amount, any even inch of that object, therefore the Mishnah comes up with a way of contending with this sort of sticky or knotty situation. And the Mishnah says that each of them has to take an oath. Now they each take an oath over a half of the object that they're grabbing onto, despite the fact that the oath doesn't match their claims, because their claims are that the entire object belongs to them. Now, there's a legal reason for this, and that's because we don't, as a religious legal system, we use oaths to try and determine unclear cases of ownership, but we don't want to create a situation where someone might be lying or taking an oath in vain. Both of them, these two people, cannot both be owners of the entire object. And so if each one of them would take a shiur, or an oath, that the entire object belonged to them, somebody, whether or not they realize it, would of course be lying, or would be speaking an oath untruly. And therefore, in a legal regard, the Mishnah creates the situation where neither person is going to be taking an obviously untrue oath, and that's why they each swear that only half of it belongs to them, or at least half of it belongs to them. But ultimately, what do they do with this object? They divide it in half. Now, what I want to point out is that the Mishnah, in contrast to the Torah, and I'm bringing this towards a conclusion for now, the Mishnah is not focusing on the original owner of the object, like the Torah did, right? The Torah was interested in trying to return the object, the object that had been lost and subsequently found, to its original owner. The Mishnah is not dealing with any attempt to return the object to its original owner. What the Mishnah is dealing with is a Metzia, how to establish new ownership over this hefker, this ownerless object. But nonetheless, it is talking about a situation of an object that has been lost and thereby left open to this kind of dispute. But what we see is that the Mishnah, rather than making the kind of, value statement that the Torah does in either one of its renditions in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, the Mishnah here is really, it's bringing it down to kind of the everyday. It's talking about the two people who are fighting over the object. This is not a lofty moral principle, but this is more of a very nitty-gritty, everyday guidance for how do we deal with people who are fighting? How do we deal with people who are both claiming ownership over this object? And that's kind of typical in many regards, in many respects of the Mishnah, that the Mishnah, unlike the Torah, is not dealing, with these big principles, with these big ideals, but rather dealing with how to contend, how to live the halacha on a very daily, mundane, everyday kind of way. And I think that that's what we see here right at the beginning of Tractate Bava Metzia. I'm going to conclude with that for today because our time is up, but I encourage you to begin tomorrow, conclude your study of Masechet Bava Kama if you've been engaged in that, and do begin studying Masechet Bava Metzia. And next week, next Sunday, we'll have an opportunity to look at some of the additional, to return to this Mishnah and to look at some more of the mishnayot of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 in a bit more depth. Thank you for your attendance today.
Thank you so much.
All
Good to
right.
see you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you to Dr. Furst. Thank you, everyone who came to. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new faces. Thank you for making time for Mishnah. More classes for Elul Zman are starting this week. You can find out on drisha.org/fall, as well as check out our classes in the Fall Zman starting after the Chagib. Take care and happy learning. Goodbye, all.